A simple farmer saves a mama cat and her 8 kittens from a burning barn, thinking it was just an act of kindness. But 1 week later, a tech billionaire's convoy arrives at his farm, and what happens next changes his life forever. The first rays of morning sun filtered through the dust-coated windows of Hank Miller's weathered farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. At 68, Hank had spent nearly every sunrise of his life on this same 100-acre plot of land in rural Montana, inherited from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Millers had worked this soil, enduring drought, economic hardship, and the relentless march of progress that had swallowed neighboring farms one by one. Hank's calloused hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug as he gazed out across his property. The peeling red barn, the rusted tractor parts scattered near the workshop, the fields that produced just enough to keep the bank at bay for another season. It wasn't much by modern standards, but it was his life's work. These days, his was one of the few remaining family farms in Clearwater County. Most had been sold off to agricultural conglomerates or wealthy city folks looking for country estates. Another day above ground is a good day, Hank muttered to himself, repeating his father's old saying as he scratched behind the ears of his aging border collie, Rusty. The dog's tail thumped against the kitchen floor in appreciative rhythm. The morning routine hadn't changed in decades. Coffee at dawn, feed the livestock, check the irrigation, then whatever seasonal work needed doing. Today, it was repairing the leaky barn roof before the forecasted afternoon thunderstorms. Hank had put it off too long already, and the last thing he needed was water damage to what little hay he'd managed to store. As Hank pulled on his worn work boots, his mind drifted to yesterday's mail. Another letter from Westland Development offering to buy his property. The 4th one this year, each with a higher figure than the last. The money would set him up comfortably for whatever years he had left, but the thought of selling felt like a betrayal of everything his family had built. "Not today, Rusty," he said to the dog. "Maybe not ever." The walk to the barn was longer these days. His doctor had warned him about his knees, suggested surgery, but Hank had waved it off. Farmers didn't have time for such luxuries. So he endured the pain, walking with a slight limp that worsened in cold weather. The old barn door protested with a creak as Hank pushed it open, sending dusty sunbeams dancing through the air. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and motor oil welcomed him into the cavernous space. Rusty trotted ahead, disappearing into the shadows as Hank gathered his tools for the roof repair. That's when he heard it, a faint mewling sound coming from the hayloft. Probably mice, he thought, though the sound seemed different somehow. Curiosity piqued, Hank set down his toolbox and made his way toward the ladder leading up to the loft. His knees protested each rung, but the mewling grew louder, driving him upward. In the dim light of the hayloft, Hank squinted, allowing his eyes to adjust. There, nestled between 2 hay bales, was a scrawny calico cat he recognized as one of the strays that occasionally prowled his property hunting mice. But she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were 8 tiny kittens, their eyes still closed, squirming and mewling against their mother's belly. "Well, I'll be," Hank murmured, kneeling carefully. The mother cat eyed him warily but didn't run. Instead, she gave a soft chirp, as if acknowledging his presence while warning him not to come closer. Hank nodded respectfully. "Don't worry, Mama. I'm not here to bother you." He'd never been much of a cat person. They were useful for keeping the rodent population down, but Hank had always maintained a respectful distance. Still, there was something about this little family that tugged at him. Maybe it was living alone these past 5 years since Margaret passed, or maybe it was just getting soft in his old age. "Guess I've got some new tenants," he said to Rusty, who had followed him up and was now watching the cats with tilted head curiosity. "You be nice to them, you hear?" Deciding to leave the new family in peace, Hank climbed back down to continue his work. He'd check on them later, maybe bring some water and whatever scraps might be suitable for a nursing mother cat. The roof repair took longer than expected. By midday, dark clouds had begun gathering on the horizon, the distant rumble of thunder announcing the approaching storm. Hank worked faster, hammering down the last of the replacement shingles just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Making his way down the ladder, Hank felt satisfied with his work. The repair wasn't pretty, but it would hold. He collected his tools, thinking about the mother cat and her kittens. He'd need to make sure their corner of the loft stayed dry. The rain intensified quickly, drumming against the metal parts of the roof he hadn't yet replaced. Hank was about to leave when he noticed something alarming. A thin tendril of smoke rising from the far corner of the barn, near the old electrical panel. His stomach dropped. "No, no, no," he muttered, rushing toward it. The ancient wiring in the barn had been on his fix-it list for years, but there was never enough time or money. Now, a spark had caught some nearby hay, and a small flame was already licking upward. Hank grabbed a horse blanket and tried to smother the flame, but the dry hay caught quickly. Within seconds, the fire had doubled in size, then tripled. The smoke thickened, making Hank cough violently as he backed away. He needed water, needed help. Fumbling for the ancient fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, Hank aimed it at the base of the flames. The extinguisher sputtered weakly before dying completely. Too old, just like everything else around here. The fire spread with terrifying speed, climbing up the wooden support beams toward the hayloft. The hayloft, where the mother cat and her kittens were trapped. Without thinking, Hank rushed to the ladder, ignoring the pain in his knees and the smoke burning his lungs. Above him, the frightened yowl of the mother cat pierced through the crackling of the flames. Rusty barked frantically from the barn entrance. "Get out, Rusty!" Hank shouted, waving his loyal companion away from danger. The dog reluctantly retreated as Hank climbed higher into the thickening smoke. The heat was intense by the time Hank reached the hayloft. Flames had already caught one edge of the wooden platform, and smoke made it nearly impossible to see. Dropping to his hands and knees where the air was slightly clearer, Hank crawled toward where he'd seen the cat family earlier. The mother cat was frantically trying to move her kittens, carrying one by the scruff of its neck. But there were too many, and the fire was moving too fast. Her eyes, wide with animal panic, met Hank's. "I've got you," Hank promised, pulling off his flannel shirt. With gentle but quick movements, he gathered the tiny kittens into the makeshift bundle. The mother cat hissed initially, but seemed to understand his intent, allowing him to collect her babies. With the precious bundle secured, Hank scooped up the mother cat with his free arm. She didn't struggle, instead clinging to his undershirt with her claws as he turned toward the ladder. Getting down was going to be the hard part. The smoke had grown so thick that Hank could barely see the rungs beneath him. His lungs burned with each breath, and his eyes watered uncontrollably. The kittens mewled in distress inside his shirt bundle, and the mother cat dug her claws deeper into his shoulder. Carefully, one step at a time, Hank descended. The heat intensified as a support beam crashed down just feet away, sending sparks flying. Hank nearly lost his footing but managed to hang on. Just a few more steps. When his boots finally touched the ground, Hank didn't waste a second. Clutching his precious cargo, he staggered toward the barn entrance. The smoke was so thick now he could barely find his way, following instinct and memory more than sight. The fresh air hit him like a physical force as he stumbled out into the rain. Gasping and coughing, Hank made it several yards from the burning structure before his legs gave out. He fell to his knees, carefully setting down his flannel bundle and the mother cat on relatively dry ground beneath an old oak tree. As the rain soaked his smoke-stained skin, Hank watched in dismay as his barn, the barn his grandfather had built, was consumed by flames. Despite the downpour, the fire was too intense to be extinguished now. All he could do was ensure it didn't spread to the house or neighboring fields. Beside him, the mother cat immediately began checking her kittens, nosing each one as if counting them. All 8 tiny bodies wiggled in response to their mother's attention, apparently unharmed. The calico looked up at Hank and gave a soft meow that sounded almost like gratitude. "You're welcome," Hank wheezed, his throat raw from smoke. "Least I could do." Rusty approached cautiously, sniffing at the feline family before sitting beside his master in silent solidarity as they watched the barn burn. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived from town, there wasn't much left to save. The structure was a total loss. Tools, equipment, feed, and decades of accumulated farm life gone in less than an hour. Fire Chief Thompson, who'd gone to high school with Hank, placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "I'm real sorry, Hank. Nothing you could have done." Hank nodded silently, still cradling the mother cat and her kittens. Chief Thompson raised an eyebrow at the unusual sight. "Found some new friends?" he asked. "They were in the loft," Hank explained, his voice hoarse. "Couldn't leave them." Thompson's expression shifted to one of concern. "You went back into a burning building for some cats? Hank, you could have been killed." Hank looked down at the mother cat, who had settled protectively around her kittens despite the commotion of firefighters and equipment. Wasn't right to let them burn. What Hank didn't say, couldn't articulate even to himself, was how in that moment of crisis, saving something, anything, had seemed vitally important. After years of losing ground inch by inch to age, economics, and changing times, he'd needed this one small victory against the inevitable. The chief shook his head but didn't press the issue. "You should get checked out. Smoke inhalation's no joke at your age." "I'm fine," Hank insisted, though his lungs felt like they were filled with ground glass. "Gotta figure out what to do about—" He gestured vaguely toward the smoldering ruins. "Insurance?" Thompson asked. Hank gave a bitter laugh that turned into a coughing fit. "Barely enough to cover the house. Had to cut back on the outbuildings last year." Another difficult choice in a long line of compromises that kept the farm running on paper, but slowly eroded its viability. As the firefighters packed up their equipment, Hank sat in the drizzling rain, a man of nearly 70 with nothing but the clothes on his back, a faithful dog, a mother cat with 8 kittens, and the crushing weight of what came next. The following morning dawned clear and bright, a cruel contrast to the charred skeleton of the barn that now dominated Hank's view from the kitchen window. He'd barely slept, his lungs still burning from smoke inhalation, and his mind racing with calculations he couldn't make add up. The loss of the barn meant more than just a building. It was his workshop, storage for feed and equipment, and shelter for what little livestock he maintained. Without it, continuing to operate even his modest farming operation seemed impossible. The mother cat and her kittens now occupied a makeshift nest in his laundry room, a cardboard box lined with an old blanket. Hank had spent part of his sleepless night researching what orphaned kittens needed, though these weren't truly orphaned. The mother cat, he'd started calling her Callie, was attentive and seemingly grateful for the safe, dry space. "Don't get too comfortable," Hank told her as he set down a saucer of milk. "Not sure how long any of us will be staying." The harsh reality was that this might be the final blow to his struggling farm. The insurance wouldn't cover rebuilding, and without the barn, he couldn't maintain even his scaled-back operation. The developer's offer was starting to look less like a betrayal and more like his only option. A knock at the door interrupted his gloomy thoughts. Rusty gave a half-hearted woof from his place by the stove, too familiar with the visitor to be truly alarmed. "It's open, Pete," Hank called, recognizing his neighbor's distinctive knock. Pete Wilson had the farm adjacent to Hank's, though farm was a generous term these days. Pete had sold off most of his agricultural land to Westland Development years ago, keeping just his house and a few acres. He now worked as a manager at the farm equipment store in town, a transition Hank had silently judged until this moment. "Heard about the barn," Pete said without preamble, setting a casserole dish on the counter. "Nancy sent this over. Said you'd probably forget to eat otherwise. Your wife's too good for you, Hank replied with a hint of his usual gruffness, though the gesture touched him more than he'd admit. Pete surveyed the kitchen, his eyes landing on the box of kittens. Thompson told me you ran into a burning building for some cats. Thought he was pulling my leg. Hank shrugged, embarrassed. Wasn't thinking clearly. Clearly, Pete echoed, shaking his head. You check in with Doc Stevens about that cough? Don't need a doctor to tell me I breathed in smoke. Pete didn't press the issue, instead moving to the window to look at the barn ruins. What's the insurance saying? Not enough, Hank admitted, joining him. Barely cover a quarter of what it'd take to rebuild. A heavy silence fell between them, the kind that comes from decades of friendship and the shared understanding of watching a way of life slowly disappear. Westland still sending those offers? Pete finally asked. Hank nodded, his jaw tightening. Got another last week, more money than before. Might be time to consider it, Hank. No shame in it. We all held out as long as we could. Anger flashed through Hank, not at Pete, but at the situation, at the inevitable march of time and economics that had backed him into this corner. My grandfather built that barn with his own hands. My father expanded this house. I was born in that bedroom upstairs, Miller land for 3 generations. And I'm supposed to just sign it all away? Pete didn't flinch at the outburst. You think your father would want you living in poverty to keep a failing farm going? Times change, Hank. Doesn't mean we forget. Before Hank could respond, his phone rang, an unusual occurrence this early. The caller ID showed Thompson Fire Department. Miller, Hank answered, his voice still rough from smoke exposure. Hank, it's Chief Thompson. Just checking in on you this morning. How's the breathing? Fine, Hank lied, turning away from Pete's skeptical gaze. Glad to hear it. Listen, something unusual happened. We had a call this morning from someone asking about your fire. Hank frowned. Reporter? No, nothing like that. Some assistant to a Mr. Gabriel Chen. Name mean anything to you? Hank exchanged a puzzled look with Pete, who shrugged. Can't say it does. Well, apparently Mr. Chen saw something about your rescue of those cats on social media and wanted details. His assistant was very specific. Wanted to know if you were the owner, if the cats survived, that sort of thing. Social media? Hank repeated, baffled. He didn't have so much as an email address, let alone any social media presence. One of my younger volunteers posted about it, called you a hero, mentioned you lost your barn. It got shared quite a bit overnight. Hank felt a flash of irritation at being made into some kind of internet spectacle. Well, you can tell this Mr. Chen that my business is my own, and I don't need charity. There was an awkward pause. Actually, Hank, I already told his people the basics. Didn't see the harm in it. This Chen fellow, he's some big tech CEO from Silicon Valley, worth billions apparently. Pete, who had been obviously eavesdropping, raised his eyebrows at this. And what does a tech billionaire want with an old farmer and some stray cats? Hank demanded. No idea, Thompson admitted. But his assistant said he might be reaching out directly. Just thought you should know. After ending the call, Hank relayed the conversation to Pete, who looked unreasonably excited. Gabriel Chen, the Gabriel Chen, founder of Nexus Technologies. Pete pulled out his phone and started typing. My son's always talking about him. He's like the new Elon Musk or something. Been all over the news for his quantum computing breakthrough. Never heard of him, Hank muttered, uncomfortable with the idea of being on this stranger's radar. Pete turned his phone screen toward Hank, showing a photo of a youthful Asian-American man with intense eyes and a casual demeanor that somehow still conveyed authority. Says here he's worth around $40 billion. Started his company in his garage at 19. Now he's 34 and revolutionizing artificial intelligence. Hank waved the phone away. Don't care if he's worth 40 trillion. Don't see what he'd want with me or my problems. Maybe he's a cat lover, Pete suggested with a smirk. Or maybe he saw a chance to do something good with all that money. Rich folks do that sometimes, help people out for the publicity. Well, he can find someone else for his publicity stunt, Hank said firmly. I'm not some charity case to make him look good on the internet. Pete's expression softened. Your pride won't rebuild that barn, Hank. Before their conversation could continue, Hank's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed a number with a California area code. Both men stared at the phone as if it might explode. After 4 rings, Hank reluctantly answered, putting it on speaker. Miller, he said gruffly. Mr. Hank Miller? The voice was female, crisp and professional. This is Olivia Reed, executive assistant to Gabriel Chen, CEO of Nexus Technologies. Mr. Chen would like to speak with you regarding yesterday's incident. Would now be convenient? Hank froze, caught off guard by the directness. Pete was making exaggerated nodding motions across the table. I suppose, Hank finally managed. Excellent. Please hold for Mr. Chen. There was a brief silence, then a new voice came on the line. Younger, energetic, with a slight accent Hank couldn't place. Mr. Miller? Gabriel Chen here. First, let me say how relieved I am that you and the cats are safe. What you did was incredibly brave. Hank shifted uncomfortably. Just did what anyone would do. A warm chuckle came through the speaker. I think you and I both know that's not true. Running into a burning building to save animals takes a special kind of person. I was quite moved when I saw the post about it. Look, Mr. Chen, Hank cut in. I appreciate the call, but if this is about some donation or publicity thing, I'm not interested. I'll figure this out on my own. There was a brief pause. Actually, Mr. Miller, I had something a bit different in mind. I happen to be on a cross-country tour of potential new Nexus Technologies locations. We're looking to establish innovation centers in rural America, bring tech jobs to places usually overlooked. Montana is on my list, and I'd very much like to meet you in person. Pete's eyes had grown wider with each word, while Hank's suspicion only deepened. Meet me? What for? Let's just say I have a proposition that might interest you, one that has nothing to do with charity and everything to do with mutual benefit. My team and I will be in the Clearwater area the day after tomorrow. Would it be possible to stop by your farm? Hank was speechless, his mind racing with confusion and disbelief. A tech billionaire wanted to visit his rundown farm. Pete leaned forward and whispered urgently, Say yes, you old fool. Mr. Miller? Chen prompted after the silence stretched too long. I suppose that would be all right, Hank finally said, his voice betraying his uncertainty. Excellent. My assistant will contact you with the details. Looking forward to meeting you, Mr. Miller. And those brave cats, of course. After the call ended, Hank stared at his phone as if it had started speaking in tongues. Do you have any idea what just happened? Pete asked, his voice tinged with awe. Hank shook his head slowly. Not a clue, but I don't trust it one bit. Hank Miller, you are the stubbornest man alive, Pete said, exasperated. A billionaire, an actual billionaire, wants to meet you, possibly help you, and you're suspicious. Nobody gives something for nothing, Hank replied, a lifetime of hard-earned pragmatism in his voice. Especially not people like that. Question is, what does he really want? As if sensing the tension in the room, Callie meowed from her box, drawing both men's attention. She was grooming one of her kittens, seemingly unconcerned with billionaires or burned barns. Guess we'll find out day after tomorrow, Pete said, his excitement undimmed. Better clean the place up a bit before then. Hank looked around his worn kitchen, at the ancient appliances and chipped countertops, and felt a wave of defensiveness. This was his home, humble as it was. If some tech billionaire was coming to gawk or condescend, he'd find Hank Miller wasn't easily impressed by money or status. He can take me as I am or not at all, Hank declared, even as a nagging voice in the back of his mind wondered what Gabriel Chen could possibly want with a broken-down old farmer, and his newly adopted cats. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of activity that left Hank more exhausted than the busiest harvest season. News of Gabriel Chen's impending visit had somehow leaked to the local community, and Hank found his typically quiet farmhouse besieged by well-meaning neighbors offering help, advice, and not-so-subtle attempts to satisfy their curiosity. Nancy Wilson had arrived that afternoon with a cleaning brigade of 4 other farmers' wives, all armed with mops, vacuum cleaners, and decades of opinions they'd apparently been saving for just such an occasion. "Hank Miller, when was the last time you dusted those ceiling fans?" Nancy had demanded, hands on her hips as she surveyed his living room. Without waiting for an answer, she directed her troops with military precision. Margaret would be rolling in her grave if she could see these windows. Hank had tried to protest, had actually opened his mouth to tell them all to go home, but the words had died in his throat at the mention of his late wife. Margaret had always kept the house spotless, a feat Hank had never managed to replicate after her passing. Instead of arguing, he'd retreated to the porch with Rusty, listening to the sounds of his home being transformed. Now, on the morning of Chen's visit, Hank had to admit the place looked better than it had in years. The hardwood floors shone, the kitchen countertops gleamed, and even the ancient refrigerator looked less decrepit after a thorough scrubbing. The women had drawn the line at the cat family, however, leaving Callie and her kittens undisturbed in their laundry room sanctuary. "You're getting fancy accommodations today," Hank told the mother cat as he set down fresh water. She blinked at him slowly before returning to nursing her kittens. Their eyes had opened yesterday, tiny blue slits taking in the world for the first time. Hank had found himself spending more time than he'd like to admit just watching them, marveling at their tiny perfection. A knock at the door startled him from his reverie. Pete entered without waiting for an invitation, carrying a garment bag. "Thought you might need something nice to wear," he explained, hanging the bag on the doorframe. "It's just my Sunday suit, but we're about the same size." Hank scowled. "I'm not playing dress-up for this fella. Got plenty of clean clothes." Pete gave him a once-over, taking in the faded flannel shirt and worn jeans that constituted Hank's idea of dressed up. "Hank, this man is worth more than the entire county combined. Would it kill you to wear a tie for once?" "Might," Hank muttered, but he eyed the garment bag with reluctant consideration. It had been years since he'd worn his own suit, Margaret's funeral to be exact. The thought of digging it out of the back of his closet, with all the memories attached to it, had been too daunting. Pete seemed to read his thoughts. "Just the shirt and tie, then? Nancy pressed them special." Hank's resistance crumbled slightly. "Fine. But I'm keeping my own pants." Pete grinned, counting this as a victory. "They're supposed to arrive around 11. Town's buzzing about it. Mike at the diner says he heard Chen's traveling with an entourage. Security, assistants, the works." Hank checked his watch. 9:30 a.m. "What am I supposed to say to someone like that? We've got nothing in common." "Just be yourself," Pete advised, then immediately reconsidered. "Well, maybe a slightly more agreeable version of yourself. And for God's sake, don't start ranting about corporate America taking over family farms." Hank grunted non-committally. He'd been thinking about exactly that topic all morning. The irony wasn't lost on him. His land was being threatened by developers. Yet here he was, preparing to welcome one of the wealthiest developers of all into his home. After Pete left, Hank reluctantly changed into the borrowed shirt and tie, feeling like he was preparing for a performance rather than a meeting. By 10:45, he was pacing the living room, alternating between straightening already straight cushions and peering out the window at his long driveway. Precisely at 11, a plume of dust appeared on the horizon. Hank's heart rate quickened as not one but 3 sleek black vehicles made their way toward his house. They were like nothing he'd seen before, not quite cars, not quite SUVs, with gleaming silver accents and tinted windows that reflected the Montana sun. "Here we go, Rusty," Hank murmured to his faithful companion. Best behavior now. The vehicles pulled up in a neat formation in front of his house. From the lead car emerged a tall woman in a crisp pantsuit who surveyed the property with quick efficiency before approaching the porch. Mr. Miller, Olivia Reed. We spoke on the phone. Thank you for accommodating Mr. Chen on such short notice. Hank nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. Ms. Reed, if you don't mind, our security team would like to do a quick sweep before Mr. Chen enters. Standard procedure. Before Hank could process what standard procedure meant, two men in dark suits had appeared, politely but firmly asking to inspect the house. Feeling increasingly out of his depth, Hank stood on the porch with Olivia while the security team went inside. Never had my house swept for security before, Hank commented, attempting casual conversation. Olivia offered a small, practiced smile. Mr. Chen values privacy and safety, especially given recent expansion of his public profile. I assure you it's nothing personal. The security team emerged moments later, giving a subtle nod to Olivia. She spoke into a small device on her wrist, and the door of the middle vehicle opened. Gabriel Chen stepped out, dressed in dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that probably cost more than Hank's monthly expenses. He looked younger in person than in the photo Pete had shown him, with an energetic presence that seemed to electrify the air around him. Chen looked around, taking in the modest farmhouse, the charred remains of the barn visible in the distance, and the wide-open Montana landscape. His face lit up with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. Mr. Miller, he said, approaching the porch with an extended hand. Gabriel Chen, thank you for meeting with me. This is quite a beautiful piece of land you have. Hank shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip that belied the man's slender build. Mr. Chen, welcome to Miller Farm. Please call me Gabe. Everyone does. Chen gestured to the vista behind him. How long has your family been here? 3 generations, Hank replied, feeling a surge of pride despite himself. My grandfather homesteaded this land in 1923. Chen nodded appreciatively. That's remarkable. A true piece of American history. Would you mind showing me around? I'd particularly like to see the barn, or what's left of it, and of course meet the famous cats. Hank found himself leading a strange procession across his property, himself and Chen in front, followed at a discreet distance by Olivia and one security guard, with Rusty trotting alongside, clearly unsure what to make of these visitors. As they walked, Chen asked insightful questions about the farm's operation, water rights, soil quality, and Hank's typical growing season. He listened with genuine interest to Hank's explanations, occasionally noting something on a small device he pulled from his pocket. You know a fair bit about farming for a tech guy, Hank observed, his initial suspicion gradually giving way to curiosity. Chen smiled. My grandparents were rice farmers in rural China before they emigrated. I spent summers with them as a child. Different crop, different country, but the same connection to the land. They paused at the burned-out shell of the barn. Up close, the destruction was even more complete than it appeared from a distance. Blackened beams reached toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and the acrid smell of smoke still lingered despite the days that had passed. This is where you ran in to save the cats? Chen asked quietly. Hank nodded, his throat tightening unexpectedly at the memory. They were up in the loft. Mama Cat had made a nest between hay bales. Chen surveyed the ruins thoughtfully. Insurance won't cover rebuilding? Not even close, Hank admitted. Had to reduce coverage last year. Premiums kept going up. And without the barn, continuing your operation becomes difficult. It wasn't a question, but Hank nodded anyway. Can't store equipment properly. No place for feed. No workshop for repairs. It's the heart of a working farm. Chen turned to face him directly. Mr. Miller, Hank, I suspect you're wondering why I'm really here. Hank appreciated the directness. Thought has crossed my mind. The simple answer is that I was moved by your story. The more complex answer is that I've been looking for something exactly like this situation, a tangible way to help preserve traditional American farming while incorporating sustainable technology. Hank frowned, not following. What's that got to do with my burned barn? Chen's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. I'd like to rebuild your barn, Mr. Miller. But not just any barn. A state-of-the-art facility that combines traditional farm functionality with cutting-edge sustainable technology. Solar power, advanced water recycling, automated systems that you control. A model for what the farm of the future could look like, while respecting agricultural traditions. Hank stared at him, waiting for the catch. And what do you get out of this? A test case. Real-world application of technologies we've been developing. Data on how they perform in an actual working farm environment. And yes, some good publicity wouldn't hurt. But that's secondary. Before Hank could respond, Chen continued, his words coming faster as his excitement grew. But this isn't charity, Mr. Miller. It would be a partnership. Your experience and knowledge combined with our technology. We would cover all costs of rebuilding and installation, and in return, we'd use the data to refine our systems for wider application. Hank felt overwhelmed. This was far beyond what he'd expected, beyond anything he could have imagined. I'd need to think about it. Talk it over. Chen nodded respectfully. Of course. But before you decide, there's someone else I'd like you to meet. He glanced toward the house. And I still haven't been introduced to those kittens. As they turned back toward the farmhouse, Hank's mind raced with questions, possibilities, and lingering suspicion. Nothing in life came without strings attached. He'd learned that lesson many times over. The question was whether these particular strings were ones he could live with, or if this opportunity, like so many others in a farmer's life, would prove too good to be true. Back at the farmhouse, Hank led Chen to the laundry room where Callie and her kittens had made their temporary home. The mother cat regarded the newcomer with typical feline wariness, positioning herself protectively in front of her litter. She's beautiful, Chen said, kneeling to get a better look without invading the cat's space. May I? He asked, looking up at Hank. Hank nodded, impressed by Chen's respectful approach. Many visitors immediately tried to touch the kittens, earning themselves a warning hiss from Callie. Chen extended his hand slowly, allowing the mother cat to sniff his fingers. After a moment's consideration, she permitted him to gently stroke her head. The kittens, less discerning than their mother, tumbled over each other in their eagerness to investigate the visitor. They've grown so much in just a few days, Hank commented, watching as a particularly bold orange tabby pawed at Chen's shoelace. They're incredible, Chen agreed, genuine delight in his voice. Have you named them yet? Hank felt a flush of embarrassment. Just the mother. Been calling her Callie. Figured naming the kittens would make it harder to find homes for them later. Something flashed across Chen's face. Understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. Attachment can be complicated, he said simply, allowing a tiny black kitten to climb onto his palm. Before Hank could respond, Olivia appeared in the doorway. Dr. Lin has arrived, she announced. Chen nodded, carefully setting the kitten back with its siblings. Perfect timing. Hank, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like Dr. Lin to check on Callie and her kittens. A vet? Hank asked, surprised. The best feline specialist on the West Coast, Chen confirmed. She consults for several major zoos and conservation programs. She's also the person I'd like you to meet regarding another aspect of my proposal. Hank hesitated. He'd been planning to take the cats to the local vet in town eventually, once things settled down, but the nearest qualified vet was over an hour's drive away and not cheap. Yet another expense he'd been avoiding. That'd be fine, he finally agreed, curiosity overcoming reluctance. Moments later, A slender woman in her 40s entered the room carrying a professional-looking medical case. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver at the temples, and she moved with a quiet efficiency that reminded Hank of the nurses at the county hospital. "Dr. May Lin," Chen introduced her. "Dr. Lin, this is Hank Miller, and these are the cats I told you about." Dr. Lin shook Hank's hand firmly. "Mr. Miller, Gabriel has told me about your heroic rescue. May I examine them?" After receiving Hank's permission, Dr. Lin set to work with practiced movements, checking each kitten thoroughly while explaining what she was doing. They appear to be about 3 weeks old. The mother is underweight but otherwise healthy. No signs of smoke inhalation damage in any of them, which is remarkable given the circumstances. "Lucky, I guess," Hank said. Dr. Lin glanced up with a knowing smile. "In my experience, Mr. Miller, luck rarely accounts for such positive outcomes. Your quick action made the difference." Once she'd completed her examination, vaccinated the mother, and left detailed instructions for kitten care, Dr. Lin packed up her equipment. "They're doing wonderfully, but I'd like to return in 2 weeks for follow-up vaccinations and checkups, if that's acceptable." Hank nodded, though he wondered where these cats would be in 2 weeks, or where he would be for that matter. "Now," Chen said, "shall we discuss the rest of my proposal? Perhaps over coffee?" Minutes later, they were seated in Hank's kitchen, the late morning sun streaming through windows that sparkled thanks to Nancy Wilson's cleaning brigade. Olivia had efficiently prepared coffee using Hank's ancient percolator, then retreated outside with the security team, leaving Hank alone with Chen and Dr. Lin. "As I mentioned at the barn," Chen began, "I'm interested in rebuilding your facility as a showcase for sustainable agricultural technology. But there's another dimension to this project that I believe might interest you, which is where Dr. Lin comes in." Dr. Lin set down her coffee cup. "Mr. Miller, I run a nonprofit organization called Second Chance Ranch. We rehabilitate injured wildlife and provide sanctuary for domestic animals with special needs. Gabriel is one of our primary benefactors." "A cat rescue?" Hank asked, confused about the connection. "Much more than that," Chen explained. "Dr. Lin's facility pioneers research in animal rehabilitation techniques and technologies. Everything from prosthetics for injured wildlife to innovative therapy approaches for trauma-affected animals. The work is rewarding," Dr. Lin continued, "but we've reached capacity at our California location. We've been searching for a suitable property to establish a second facility, ideally somewhere with more space, clean air, and a community that values connection to the land." Hank began to see where this was heading. "And you think my farm fits the bill?" Chen leaned forward, his enthusiasm evident. "I'm proposing a dual-purpose rebuild, Hank. A working barn for your farm operations, powered by sustainable technology, alongside a state-of-the-art animal rehabilitation center operated by Dr. Lin's organization. Your property has the perfect combination of accessibility and seclusion, with enough acreage to accommodate both operations comfortably." Hank's mind reeled at the scale of what Chen was suggesting. This wasn't just about rebuilding his barn anymore. It was about transforming his entire property. "The benefits would be substantial," Dr. Lin added gently, perhaps sensing his overwhelm. "Full-time employment opportunities for local residents, educational programs for schools, potential revenue from ecotourism, and of course a fully restored and improved barn for your farming operations, at no cost to you." "What happens to my land?" Hank asked, cutting to his primary concern. "Who owns what?" Chen nodded approvingly, as if he'd expected this question. "You would retain full ownership of your property. We would lease a portion, let's say 20 acres, for the rehabilitation center, with a 20-year renewable contract. The lease income would provide you with stable revenue regardless of agricultural market fluctuations." Hank sat back, stunned by the comprehensiveness of the proposal. It addressed not just his immediate problem, the destroyed barn, but the longer-term viability issues that had been haunting him for years. "This sounds too good to be true," he said finally, decades of farmer's caution asserting itself. "What's the catch?" Chen smiled, not offended by the directness. "No catch, but there are challenges. Construction would be disruptive for several months. The technology integration has a learning curve, and there would be media attention, especially initially, something I suspect you might not welcome." Hank glanced out the window toward the remains of his barn, thinking of his dwindling savings and the Westland development offer that had been weighing on him. "Why me?" he asked abruptly. "Out of all the farmers in Montana, in America, why pick my burned-down barn for your showcase project?" Dr. Lin answered before Chen could. "Because you ran into a burning building to save 9 cats, Mr. Miller. That tells us everything we need to know about your character. The technical answer," Chen added, "is that your location is ideal. Your property has the right features, and the timing aligned with our expansion plans. But Dr. Lin's right. It was your actions that made us take notice. People who put themselves at risk for animals are exactly who we want to partner with." Hank fell silent, processing the magnitude of the opportunity before him. It wasn't just about saving his farm anymore. It was about transforming it into something he'd never imagined, something that might carry the Miller legacy forward in ways his grandfather could never have envisioned. "I need time to think," he said finally. "This is a lot to take in." "Of course," Chen agreed immediately. "Take all the time you need. We'll leave the detailed proposal with you, including architectural concepts, financial projections, and contract terms. Review it carefully, consult with advisors you trust." As if on cue, Olivia reappeared with a sleek leather portfolio, which she placed on the table. "There's one more thing," Chen said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back before sliding it across the table. "My personal number. Not my assistant, not my office. Me. Call any time with questions or concerns." The gesture's significance wasn't lost on Hank. A man whose time was presumably worth thousands of dollars per minute was offering direct access. "I appreciate that," Hank said, tucking the card into his shirt pocket. As they rose to leave, Dr. Lin paused. "One last thing, Mr. Miller. Would you mind if I took blood samples from Callie and the kittens on my next visit? We're conducting research on how trauma affects maternal behavior in felines, and their experience might provide valuable data." "I suppose that would be all right," Hank agreed, walking them to the door. Standing on his porch, watching the convoy of black vehicles disappear down his driveway in a cloud of dust, Hank felt as though he'd been caught up in a whirlwind that had suddenly deposited him back on solid ground, leaving everything around him transformed. Rusty nudged his hand, bringing him back to the present moment. "Well, boy," Hank murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears, "what do you make of all that?" From inside, the faint mewing of kittens called him back to his immediate responsibilities, even as his mind raced with possibilities for a future he'd never dared to imagine. By late afternoon, Hank's farmhouse had become the epicenter of the most excitement Clearwater County had seen in decades. Word of Gabriel Chen's visit had spread through the community with the speed and efficiency that only small-town gossip networks could achieve. Pete and Nancy were the first to arrive, barely waiting until Chen's convoy had disappeared over the horizon before pulling into Hank's driveway. "Well," Pete demanded, practically bouncing with anticipation as he followed Hank into the kitchen. "What did he want? What did he say?" Nancy was more practical, immediately putting on coffee and pulling out the casserole she'd brought earlier to heat it up. "Let the man breathe, Pete. He's had a day." Hank sank into his chair at the kitchen table, feeling every one of his 68 years. The emotional whiplash of the past few days, from the despair following the barn fire to the bewildering proposal Chen had just presented, had left him exhausted in a way that even the hardest physical labor never did. "It's complicated," he finally said, gesturing to the leather portfolio Chen had left. He wants to rebuild the barn, but that's just the beginning. Over the next hour, as Hank explained the proposal, Pete and Nancy listened with increasing astonishment. By the time Hank finished, they were both staring at him wide-eyed. "An animal rehabilitation center? Here?" Nancy asked, trying to grasp the scale of what Chen was proposing. "With jobs for local people," Hank confirmed, still processing it himself. Pete had been flipping through the portfolio, examining the architectural renderings and financial projections. "Hank, do you have any idea how much money they're talking about investing here? This is millions, maybe tens of millions." "I gathered it wasn't cheap," Hank replied dryly. "Not cheap?" Pete laughed incredulously. "This barn they're proposing is better equipped than most hospitals in the state. Solar panels, geothermal heating, automated feeding systems, and the rehabilitation center looks like something out of a science fiction movie." Nancy had moved to stand behind her husband, looking over his shoulder at the renderings. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "But Hank, how do you feel about all this? It would change everything." That was the question Hank had been asking himself since Chen left. How did he feel about such a fundamental transformation of the land his family had worked for generations? Was this an evolution of the Miller legacy, or a betrayal of it? "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me thinks my grandfather would roll over in his grave at the idea of turning any of our land into some high-tech animal hospital. But another part thinks he'd be proud you found a way to keep the farm in the family while moving it into the future," Nancy finished gently. Hank nodded, grateful for her understanding. "And there's the practical side. Even if I rebuild the barn with insurance and savings, I'd be operating on such a thin margin that one bad season could wipe me out. The lease income from this project would provide stability I haven't had in years." Pete, ever the pragmatist, pointed to a section of the financial summary. "Look at the employment projections. 30 full-time positions initially, scaling up to 50 within 5 years. Clearwater hasn't seen job creation like that since the lumber mill expanded in the 90s. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Sheriff Dave Connor stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable in his official capacity. "Evening, Hank. Sorry to bother you, but I've got a situation brewing in town I thought you should know about." Hank invited him in, introducing him to the ongoing discussion with a brief summary of Chen's visit. Sheriff Connor whistled low. "That explains the commotion. There's a town council meeting happening right now, called on emergency basis. Marcus Westland is there, and he's not happy." Hank felt a knot form in his stomach. Marcus Westland was the CEO of Westland Development, the company that had been pressuring him to sell his land. Their interest wasn't just in Hank's property, but in consolidating large swaths of the county for a planned luxury resort and golf course. "What's he saying?" Pete asked. "That this Chen fellow is interfering with established business interests in the county. That bringing in outside development without proper community consultation is irresponsible. He's got Mayor Simmons practically eating out of his hand." "But I haven't even agreed to anything yet," Hank protested. Sheriff Connor shrugged apologetically. "Doesn't seem to matter. Westland's painting this as some Silicon Valley billionaire swooping in to disrupt local planning. He's calling for a moratorium on any new development approvals until his project has been fully processed." Hank felt a surge of anger. "So it's fine for him to buy up half the county for golf courses, but if someone wants to create jobs and save farms, that's a problem?" "Politics," Sheriff Connor said simply. "Westland's donated generously to a lot of local campaigns over the years, including the mayor's. That buys influence." Pete was indignant. "This is ridiculous. The town council can't stop a private landowner from leasing their property for a legitimate business." "They can make the permitting process a nightmare," Nancy pointed out. "Building codes, environmental reviews, zoning variances. There are 1,000 ways to delay a project until it becomes too expensive to pursue." Hank felt the hope that had been building all day begin to crumble. He should have known it wouldn't be this easy. Nothing in farming ever was. "Maybe I should go to this meeting," he said, rising from his chair. Sheriff Connor placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "That's why I came to warn you. It's getting heated in there. Westland has his supporters, but there's also a contingent that's excited about Chen's project. Better to let things cool down before you step into that hornet's nest." A buzz from Hank's phone interrupted them. A text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Miller, Gabriel Chen here. I've been informed of the town council situation. Please don't worry. My legal team is monitoring. Would appreciate a call when convenient." Hank stared at the message in disbelief. How had Chen learned about a hastily called town council meeting in a tiny Montana town within hours of it happening? As if reading his thoughts, Sheriff Connor chuckled. "When you're worth billions, you've got eyes and ears everywhere. My guess is his team was doing due diligence on local politics before he even knocked on your door." Pete, who had read the message over Hank's shoulder, grinned triumphantly. "See? The man's already fighting for this project. That should tell you something." For the first time since the barn fire, Hank felt something like genuine hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping at straws, but something more substantial. Maybe this crazy proposal wasn't just a rich man's whim or a publicity stunt. Maybe Gabriel Chen was exactly what he appeared to be. Someone with the resources and determination to make this vision a reality, regardless of local political obstacles. "I should call him back," Hank said, reaching for his phone. Nancy stopped him with a gentle hand. "Eat something first. You've barely touched food all day and you think clearer on a full stomach." As Nancy served up her casserole, the conversation shifted to practical matters. What questions Hank should ask Chen, what local concerns might need addressing, how the project could be positioned to maximize community support. By the time Hank finally called Chen back, the kitchen had emptied, with promises from Pete, Nancy, and Sheriff Connor to keep him updated on developments in town. Rusty lay at his feet, while Callie had surprisingly emerged from the laundry room to curl up on a kitchen chair, as if wanting to be part of this important discussion. Chen answered on the first ring. "Mr. Miller, thank you for calling. Seems your project is already causing quite a stir," Hank said, deciding to get straight to the point. "So I've heard," Chen replied, his tone relaxed. "Marcus Westland is a determined businessman with significant investments in the area. His opposition is neither surprising nor concerning." "The town council listens to him," Hank pointed out. "They do," Chen agreed. "But they also listen to their constituents, and local jobs tend to be very persuasive in small communities. More importantly, while Mr. Westland has influence, we have something more valuable in this situation." "What's that?" "The law on our side. His proposed moratorium would be legally questionable at best, potentially unconstitutional at worst. My attorneys have already drafted a polite but firm letter explaining this to the council." Hank was impressed by the speed and efficiency with which Chen had responded to this obstacle, but a nagging worry remained. "I don't want to bring a legal battle to my community. These are my neighbors." "I understand completely," Chen said, his voice softening. "And that's not my preferred approach either, which is why I've also authorized Dr. Lin to attend tomorrow's regular council session to present the project benefits directly. Jobs, tax revenue, educational opportunities. Much better to win with persuasion than legal threats." The tension in Hank's shoulders eased slightly. "I appreciate that." "Mr. Miller, Hank, I meant what I said about this being a partnership. We'll navigate these challenges together, with respect for your community relationships. This isn't my first experience with local opposition to new projects, and I've found transparency and genuine engagement always work better than strong-arm tactics." As the conversation continued, Hank found himself warming to Chen's approach. The man clearly had experience navigating complex situations with multiple stakeholders, and he seemed genuinely committed to making this project work, not just pushing it through regardless of local concerns. By the time they hung up, Hank had made his decision. The opportunity was too significant, the potential benefits too great to let fear or Westland's opposition deter him. "What do you think, Callie?" he asked the cat, who blinked at him slowly from her perch on the kitchen chair. "Ready to be part of something bigger than both of us?" Her rumbling purr seemed answer enough. The Clearwater County Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this size since the contentious debate over the new high school gymnasium 5 years ago. Every folding chair was filled, with dozens more people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The regularly scheduled town council meeting had transformed into the hottest ticket in the county, after word spread that representatives from both Westland Development and Gabriel Chen's team would be presenting. Hank sat in the back row, having slipped in just as the meeting was called to order. He'd purposely avoided the empty seat Pete had saved near the front, preferring to observe without becoming the center of attention. Despite Sheriff Connor's warning about emotions running high, Hank had decided he needed to witness this clash of visions for his community's future firsthand. Mayor Simmons, a portly man with thinning hair who'd held the position for nearly 2 decades, called for order with practiced authority. As many of you know, we've added 2 special presentations to tonight's agenda. First, we'll hear from Mr. Marcus Westland regarding updates to the proposed Clearwater Resort and Golf Community. Following that, Dr. May Lin will present information about a potential animal rehabilitation center at the Miller property. Marcus Westland approached the podium with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. His tailored suit and carefully coiffed silver hair projected an image of success and authority that had served him well in building his development empire. "Good evening, friends and neighbors," he began, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "For the past 3 years, I've been working closely with your elected officials to bring sustainable, responsible growth to Clearwater County. Our resort project represents a $200 million investment in this community's future, the largest private investment in county history." Digital renderings appeared on the projection screen behind him, showing gleaming buildings nestled among manicured landscapes, with snow-capped mountains in the background. "We're creating over 300 construction jobs and 250 permanent positions," Westland continued. "Property tax revenues will fund much-needed infrastructure improvements and boost the school budget by an estimated 30%. We've conducted extensive environmental impact studies and modified our plans repeatedly to address community concerns." Hank had to admit the presentation was polished and persuasive. Westland clearly knew his audience, emphasizing jobs, tax benefits, and environmental stewardship, the trifecta of rural development selling points. But yesterday, Westland's tone shifted. "A Silicon Valley billionaire with no connection to our community arrived unannounced, proposing a competing development on property his company is attempting to acquire. No environmental studies, no community input, no consideration for how this might impact our carefully developed county growth plan." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Hank felt his face grow hot at the mischaracterization. Chen wasn't trying to acquire his property, and Hank certainly wasn't being pressured to sell, unlike many of his neighbors who'd succumbed to Westland's persistent offers. "I'm not suggesting we turn away potential investment," Westland said, his voice reasonable. "I'm simply asking for a fair process. The same multi-year review my project underwent, the same environmental scrutiny, the same community input periods. Rushing to approve an unvetted project from an out-of-state corporation would be irresponsible governance and potentially legally problematic." Mayor Simmons nodded along, his agreement transparent. When Westland finished, the mayor thanked him effusively before introducing Dr. Lin with notably less enthusiasm. Dr. Lin approached the podium with the same quiet confidence Hank had observed during her visit to his farm. She wore a simple business suit rather than the casual attire from the day before, but her demeanor remained calm and unruffled. "Good evening," she began. "I'm Dr. May Lin, founder of Second Chance Ranch, a non-profit organization dedicated to wildlife rehabilitation and animal welfare. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce our proposed Montana facility to this community. Her presentation style contrasted sharply with Westland's slick delivery. Dr. Lynn spoke directly and plainly, without marketing flourishes or emotional appeals. She described the proposed rehabilitation center in detail, its focus on native wildlife and domestic animals with special needs, the research component, the educational outreach programs for local schools. We anticipate creating 30 full-time positions initially, she explained, including veterinary technicians, wildlife specialists, maintenance staff, and administrative support. These would be year-round jobs with competitive salaries and benefits, not seasonal positions dependent on tourist traffic. Photographs from the California facility appeared on screen, showing injured eagles receiving treatment, staff members working with rehabilitation patients, and school groups touring the educational areas. Unlike a traditional development, our facility would preserve the agricultural character of the property, Dr. Lynn continued. Mr. Miller would retain full ownership of his land and continue farming operations with an improved, technologically advanced barn funded by our organization. We would lease approximately 20 acres for the rehabilitation center, providing stable income regardless of agricultural market fluctuations. The distinction wasn't lost on the audience. Westland wanted to buy land outright and transform it completely. Chen's proposal allowed for continued farming while adding a compatible use to a portion of the property. When Dr. Lynn finished her presentation, hands shot up throughout the audience. Mayor Simmons reluctantly began calling on people, clearly hoping to minimize discussion of Chen's proposal. "What about traffic?" asked a woman near the front. "Would this bring a lot of tourist buses to our rural roads?" "We're not designed as a tourist attraction," Dr. Lynn explained. "While we would have educational components and occasional visitors, our primary purpose is rehabilitation and research. The California facility averages fewer than 50 visitors per day, most in small groups." A middle-aged man in coveralls stood next. "These jobs you're talking about, would they go to local folks, or would you bring in specialists from outside?" "Both," Dr. Lynn answered honestly. "Some positions require specialized training in wildlife medicine, but many jobs would be available to local residents. We also plan to establish internship programs with regional community colleges and universities to train local people for more specialized roles over time." The questions continued, with Dr. Lynn answering each one directly and without defensiveness. Hank noticed a subtle shift in the room's energy as people began to lean forward, engaged by the possibilities rather than suspicious of them. Marcus Westland observed this changing tide with visible tension, his jaw tightening as positive murmurs followed Dr. Lynn's responses. When Mayor Simmons announced they needed to move on to regular council business, Westland immediately approached him for a whispered conversation. As the meeting shifted to mundane city matters, Hank slipped out, not wanting to draw attention. Outside in the cool evening air, he found Dr. Lynn standing alone, looking up at the star-filled Montana sky. "You handled that well," Hank said, joining her. She smiled. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you would. Needed to see for myself. You made quite an impression in there." "People respond to authenticity," she said simply. "We're not selling a fantasy or making empty promises. The work we do is real, and the benefits to this community would be real too." Hank nodded thoughtfully. Westland didn't look happy. "No," Dr. Lynn agreed. "Men like him aren't accustomed to competition, especially from non-profit organizations with different priorities than pure profit." As if summoned by mention of his name, Marcus Westland emerged from the community center, flanked by two assistants. He spotted Hank and Dr. Lynn, and after a moment's hesitation, changed course to approach them. "Mr. Miller," he said, extending his hand, "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of meeting in person, though my office has reached out several times." Hank shook the offered hand briefly. "Mr. Westland." "I hope you're considering all your options carefully," Westland continued, his tone friendly but eyes sharp. "My offer for your property still stands, and I'm prepared to increase it substantially. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. Cash in hand. No complications. No risks." Before Hank could respond, Westland turned to Dr. Lin. "Doctor, your presentation was quite inspiring. However, I wonder if you've fully considered the logistical challenges of this location. The county infrastructure plan prioritizes the southern corridor for the next 5 years of improvements: roads, utilities, emergency services. Your proposed northern location might face significant hurdles." The implication was clear. Westland had influence over county planning and wasn't afraid to use it to create obstacles. Dr. Lin's expression remained pleasant. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Westland. We've conducted thorough due diligence and feel confident in our ability to address any logistical challenges. Our California facility was built in an even more remote location with great success." Westland's smile tightened. "California isn't Montana, Doctor. Things work differently here. Community relationships matter." He turned back to Hank. "Think about my offer, Mr. Miller. No pressure, but opportunities like this don't come along every day for properties like yours." With a curt nod, he walked away toward a waiting SUV. Was that a threat or a bribe? Hank wondered aloud. "Both, I imagine," Dr. Lin replied. "Men like Westland see the world in terms of transactions and power. He's offering money while reminding you of his influence." Hank watched Westland's vehicle pull away, feeling the weight of the decision before him more acutely than ever. This wasn't just about rebuilding his barn anymore, or even saving his farm. It had become a choice between competing visions for his community's future. "Dr. Lin," he said slowly, "I think I'm ready to move forward with this project." She studied his face carefully. "Are you certain? Westland will likely make things difficult." Hank thought about his burned barn, about Callie and her kittens, about his family's legacy on this land. Finally, he thought about the choice between selling to a developer who would erase every trace of the Miller farm, or partnering with people who valued both its past and its potential future. "I'm certain," he said, his voice gaining conviction. "Let's do this." The transformation of Miller Farm began with surprising swiftness. Within 3 days of Hank's decision, a preliminary survey team arrived to assess the property and collect soil samples. By the end of the week, a detailed timeline had been established, permits had been filed with the county, and the first shipment of materials was scheduled for delivery. Gabriel Chen himself had called to thank Hank personally, their conversation warm but brief. The billionaire was apparently in Singapore for a quantum computing conference, but promised to return for the groundbreaking ceremony in 2 weeks. Now, sitting at his kitchen table with Olivia Reed and a project manager named Jackson, Hank tried to absorb the flurry of information being presented to him. "We'll start with site preparation next Monday," Jackson explained, pointing to a detailed diagram. "Clearing the burned barn debris, grading the area, laying preliminary utility lines. The foundation work begins the following week." Hank nodded, trying to look like he understood the complexities of modern construction. His father and grandfather had built their additions to the original barn with nothing more than basic tools, manpower, and determination. This operation, with its geological surveys and environmental impact assessments, seemed like something from another world. "What about my daily operations?" he asked. "I've still got fields that need tending." Olivia smiled reassuringly. "We've planned for that, Mr. Miller. The construction zones will be clearly delineated and won't interfere with your access to working areas. We're also preparing temporary storage for your equipment that would normally be housed in the barn." "And Callie and her kittens?" Hank found himself asking, surprised by how important their welfare had become to him. Dr. Lin has suggested they remain in your care for now, Olivia replied. They're thriving under your attention. Once the kittens reach 8 weeks, we can discuss options for their future. Something in her tone suggested there might be plans for the cat family that hadn't yet been shared with him. Before Hank could inquire further, a truck appeared on his driveway, dust billowing behind it. That would be the delivery from Granite Falls Hardware, Jackson said, checking his watch. Right on schedule. Hank peered out the window, confused. I didn't order anything from Granite Falls. Olivia consulted her tablet. It's the materials for your temporary workshop, Mr. Miller. Mr. Chen authorized an immediate setup so you wouldn't be without working space during construction. Sure enough, the truck was loaded with lumber, tools, and what appeared to be prefabricated building components. As Hank watched, a second vehicle pulled in behind it, Pete's pickup truck. I took the liberty of contacting your neighbor, Mr. Wilson, Olivia explained. He mentioned he'd be happy to help with assembly. Hank felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for the thoughtfulness, discomfort at having decisions made for him, and a sense of being swept along in a current far stronger than he was. But practicality won out. He did need a workshop, and the burn site cleanup wouldn't begin for several days. Guess I'd better go help then, he said, rising from the table. The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Mornings began with Hank tending to his regular farm duties, followed by construction of the temporary workshop with Pete and several other neighbors who'd volunteered their assistance. Afternoons often included meetings with various members of Chen's team, architects finalizing details, technology specialists explaining systems Hank barely comprehended, even a landscaper discussing native plant restoration around the new buildings. By Friday, the temporary workshop stood complete, a sturdy, well-designed structure that was, Hank had to admit, better than many permanent buildings in the county. Equipped with new tools to replace those lost in the fire, organized storage systems, and even a small office area, it made his previous workshop seem primitive by comparison. "This is just the temporary space?" Sheriff Connor asked incredulously during an impromptu gathering to celebrate its completion. Several neighbors had stopped by, curiosity about the Chen project overcoming any reservations about being seen as nosy. Hank nodded, still adjusting to the reality himself. "Wait till you see the plans for the permanent barn. Makes this look like a garden shed." "Heard Westland's raising hell down at the county offices," Frank Mercer commented, helping himself to one of Nancy's cookies. As the owner of the local feed store, Frank heard most of the gossip that circulated through the farming community. Challenging every permit application, demanding additional reviews. Pete snorted. "Not getting him very far from what I hear. Chen's lawyers are too good, and his team filed everything by the book." "He switched tactics," Nancy added. "Now he's going after Chen personally. Had a letter in the county paper yesterday questioning his motives, suggesting he's using Clearwater as a tax write-off or publicity stunt." Hank hadn't seen the letter, having avoided town as much as possible since making his decision. He preferred focusing on the tangible progress happening on his property to the political drama swirling around it. "Chen doesn't seem concerned," he said, more confidently than he felt. In truth, the continuing opposition made him uneasy. Farming had taught him that even the most promising crops could fail with a sudden change in weather or an unexpected blight. As if sensing his thoughts, Callie appeared from the farmhouse, making her way delicately across the yard to the workshop. The mother cat had grown increasingly comfortable with human presence over the past week, though she remained protective of her kittens, who were now beginning to explore beyond their laundry room nest. "Well, look who's coming to inspect the new facilities," Pete chuckled as Callie entered the workshop, her tail held high as she conducted a thorough examination of the premises. The gathering dispersed as evening approached, leaving Hank alone with his thoughts and an increasingly affectionate Callie, who had apparently approved of the construction and now rubbed against his ankles, purring loudly. "At least you're easy to please," Hank told her, bending with a grunt to stroke her fur. Just need food, shelter, and some attention. His phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. Opening it, he was surprised to find a series of photographs showing heavy equipment being loaded onto flatbed trucks. The accompanying message read, "Equipment mobilizing for Monday. Thought you might like to see what's coming. GC." Hank studied the images with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. The scale of the machinery indicated just how significant this project truly was. Another message followed, moments later. Dr. Lin mentioned concerns about Westland's continued opposition. Please know we anticipated this and are well prepared. Some projects face headwinds. This one has you as its foundation, which makes it stronger than any obstacle. Rest well this weekend. The real work begins Monday. The personal touch was unexpected. Chen must have thousands of business concerns spanning the globe, yet he'd taken a moment to send reassurance about this relatively small project in rural Montana. Hank wasn't sure what to make of it. Sunday evening brought another unexpected visitor. Hank was just finishing his dinner when a black SUV with government plates pulled up his driveway. A woman in her 50s, dressed in a no-nonsense pantsuit, approached his door and knocked briskly. "Mr. Miller, I'm Catherine Delaney, Regional Director for the Economic Development Administration. May I come in?" Bewildered, Hank invited her inside. She declined his offer of coffee, getting straight to business. "I'll be direct, Mr. Miller. My office has received multiple complaints regarding the proposed development on your property, along with counter-filings defending it. Normally, we wouldn't intervene in local matters at this stage, but given the high-profile nature of the parties involved and the potential economic impact on the region, I wanted to assess the situation personally." "I see," Hank said cautiously, unsure whose side this government official might be on. "I've reviewed the project plans," she continued. "The proposed rehabilitation center aligns well with our rural economic diversification goals. The sustainable technology components are particularly noteworthy." Hank relaxed slightly. "That's good to hear. However," Director Delaney added, "the complaints raised by Westland Development cannot be entirely dismissed. There are legitimate questions about potential impacts on infrastructure, emergency services capacity, and compatibility with existing county development plans." The knot in Hank's stomach tightened again. "Are you saying the project might not be approved?" Director Delaney's expression softened slightly. "I'm saying there are regulatory hurdles that need addressing, but I'm also saying that, from a federal perspective, this type of innovative rural development is exactly what we want to encourage. My presence here should indicate the level of interest this project has generated, both positive and negative." After she left, promising to monitor the situation closely, Hank sat on his porch swing, watching the Montana sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Rusty lay at his feet, while Callie had claimed a spot on the porch railing, her silhouette elegant against the fading light. Tomorrow, the machines would arrive. The transformation would begin in earnest. There would be no turning back, no matter what obstacles Westland or anyone else might throw in their path. "In for a penny, in for a pound," Hank murmured to his animal companions. "Guess we're making history, whether we wanted to or not." The arrival of the construction equipment early Monday morning created a spectacle unlike anything Clearwater County had seen in decades. A convoy of massive trucks carrying excavators, bulldozers, and specialized machinery rumbled down the rural roads, drawing curious onlookers who parked along the roadside to watch. Children waved excitedly from car windows, farmers paused in their fields, and even the usually stoic postal carrier stopped to take photographs with her phone. Hank observed the procession from his porch, a cup of coffee cooling in his weathered hands. The scale of the operation was both impressive and intimidating. This was no local contractor with a pickup truck and a backhoe. This was industrial-grade construction, with equipment bearing the Nexus Technologies logo emblazoned in sleek silver against matte black. Jackson, the project manager, approached with a clipboard and hard hat. "Morning, Mr. Miller. Ready for day one?" Hank nodded, accepting the hard hat Jackson offered. "Suppose I am. That's quite a parade you've brought to my doorstep." "Just the first wave," Jackson said with a grin. "We're starting with site clearing and foundation prep. The specialty equipment for the barn's renewable energy systems arrives next week." As they walked toward the burned barn site, Hank noticed a small crowd had gathered at his property line. Some were neighbors he recognized. Others appeared to be curiosity seekers drawn by word of mouth. Among them stood a man with a professional camera and a woman taking notes. The local newspaper, most likely. "We've set up a public viewing area," Jackson explained, following Hank's gaze. "Decided it was better to accommodate interest safely than have people trying to sneak peeks. There's an information booth with project details and someone from our community relations team to answer questions." Hank raised an eyebrow. "You've thought of everything." Mr. Chen's directive was to be transparent and engaging with the community from day one. He believes the more people understand what we're building, the more support we'll gain. The demolition of what remained of the old barn began with surprising gentleness. Rather than simply bulldozing the charred structure, workers carefully dismantled it piece by piece. Hank watched as they meticulously salvaged any timber that could be repurposed, setting aside the least damaged beams and boards. "We'll incorporate elements of the original structure into the new design," Jackson explained. "Connection to the past is important, especially in agricultural communities." By mid-morning, a steady stream of vehicles was arriving and departing, not just construction-related, but locals coming to witness the activity. Nancy Wilson had set up an impromptu refreshment stand at the end of Hank's driveway, selling coffee and homemade pastries to the growing crowd. "Hope you don't mind," she called to Hank when he wandered over during a break. Seemed like an opportunity to provide a service, 10% of proceeds to the volunteer fire department. Hank couldn't help but smile at her entrepreneurial spirit. "No objections here." "Quite the show they're putting on," Pete commented, appearing at Hank's side with a donut in hand. "Half the county's called in sick today just to come watch." Before Hank could respond, a sleek black car pulled up, not one of Chen's vehicles, but an expensive European sedan with tinted windows. Marcus Westland emerged, immaculately dressed as always, his expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses. "Great," Hank muttered. "Just what we need." Westland surveyed the construction site, then approached the information booth, where he engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with the Nexus representative. After a few minutes, he turned and made his way directly toward Hank. "Mr. Miller," Westland greeted him with practiced cordiality. "Quite an operation you've allowed on your property." "Mr. Westland," Hank replied neutrally. "Something I can help you with?" The developer removed his sunglasses, his sharp eyes assessing Hank with calculated interest. "I wanted to see for myself what all the fuss was about, and perhaps to make one final appeal to your practical nature." "I'm listening," Hank said, though his tone suggested little openness to whatever Westland might propose. "This project of Chen's, it's ambitious, I'll grant you that, but ambitious projects face ambitious obstacles." Westland gestured toward the construction site. "Permits can be challenged. Regulatory reviews can take months, even years. Environmental concerns can arise unexpectedly." Pete bristled beside Hank. "Sounds like you're planning to cause problems." Westland smiled thinly. "I'm simply pointing out realities, Mr. Wilson. Development is complicated, particularly when it doesn't align with established county plans." He turned back to Hank. "My offer still stands, Mr. Miller. $5 million cash, no contingencies. You could be relaxing in Arizona by next month instead of living in a construction zone for the next year, assuming this project even survives the regulatory gauntlet." The number hit Hank like a physical blow. $5 million was more than double Westland's previous offer, far more than his property was worth by any conventional valuation. It was enough to retire in comfort, to never worry about money again, to leave farming and its endless challenges behind forever. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if Westland was right about the regulatory hurdles? What if Chen lost interest when complications mounted? What if Hank found himself stuck with a half-completed project and no recourse? A soft meow interrupted his thoughts. Callie had followed him to the driveway and now wound herself around his ankles, her purr audible even amid the construction noise. The mother cat had never ventured this far from the house before, apparently having decided that wherever Hank went was safe territory. Looking down at the animal he'd risked his life to save, Hank felt clarity return. This wasn't just about money, or even about preserving his farm. It was about the kind of future he wanted to help create, for himself, for his community, and for creatures who depended on human choices for their well-being. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Westland," Hank said, his voice steady and sure. "But my decision is made. This project is going forward." Westland's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Miller. Chen's using you as a pawn in his corporate image game. When complications arise, and they will, you'll find yourself abandoned with a torn-up property and broken promises." "Maybe," Hank conceded, "but I'd rather take that risk than sell my family's legacy to be paved over for a golf course." For a moment, Westland's carefully maintained facade cracked, revealing genuine anger, but he quickly recovered, sliding his sunglasses back into place. "We'll see how you feel in 6 months. My door remains open, though my offer may not be quite so generous next time." As Westland returned to his car, Pete let out a low whistle. $5 million? That's serious money, Hank." "It is," Hank agreed, watching the developer's sedan disappear down his driveway. "But some things aren't for sale at any price." The confrontation with Westland seemed to energize rather than discourage the construction team. By late afternoon, the old barn had been completely cleared, the debris sorted for recycling or repurposing, and the foundation area prepared for excavation. The efficiency was remarkable. What might have taken a local crew weeks had been accomplished in a single day. As the sun began to set and the workers packed up for the evening, Dr. Lynn arrived for her scheduled checkup on Callie and the kittens. Hank led her to the laundry room, where the kittens were becoming increasingly active, tumbling over each other in playful combat. "They're thriving," Dr. Lynn observed, gently examining each tiny bundle of fur. "You've done an excellent job with them, Mr. Miller." "Callie's the one doing the hard work," Hank demurred. "I just provide the accommodations." Dr. Lynn smiled knowingly. "The food, clean water, safe space, regular care, and, unless I'm mistaken, quite a bit of affection. That's considerably more than accommodations." Hank felt his ears redden slightly. He had indeed found himself spending more time than strictly necessary with the cat family, particularly in the evenings when the house felt especially empty. "I saw your temporary workshop," Dr. Lynn commented as she packed up her medical supplies. "Quite impressive for an interim solution." "Chen doesn't do anything by half measures, it seems," Hank replied. "No, he doesn't," she agreed. "Which is why Westland's threats won't amount to much in the end. Gabriel didn't become who he is by backing down from challenges." Hank looked at her curiously. "You sound like you know him well." "We've worked together for several years," Dr. Lynn acknowledged. "His support made Second Chance Ranch possible. But more than that, I consider him a friend, something Gabriel doesn't bestow lightly." "Why is this project so important to him?" Hank asked, the question that had been nagging at him since Chen's first visit. "Surely he has bigger concerns than one old farmer's barn and some stray cats." Dr. Lynn considered her words carefully. "Gabriel believes in what he calls keystone moments, seemingly small events that have the potential to create disproportionate positive change. Your act of bravery, running into that burning building to save these cats, resonated with him deeply for personal reasons I'm not at liberty to discuss. She closed her medical case with a decisive click. What I can tell you is that his commitment to this project goes beyond business or publicity. He sees something here worth fighting for, a model for how technology and tradition can coexist and strengthen each other rather than being in opposition. As Dr. Lin departed, Hank found himself pondering her words. The idea that his impulsive act of animal rescue might represent some kind of keystone moment seemed far-fetched. Yet the evidence of Chen's commitment was tangible. Millions of dollars in equipment and personnel now mobilized on his property, with more arriving daily. Watching the sunset from his porch, with Rusty at his feet and Callie unexpectedly curled in his lap, Hank allowed himself to feel something he'd nearly forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate hope of clinging to the past, but the expansive hope of building something new while honoring what came before. The day of the official groundbreaking ceremony dawned clear and warm. The Montana sky an endless blue canvas stretched above Miller Farm. In the 2 weeks since construction began, progress had been remarkable. The foundation for both the new barn and the rehabilitation center had been excavated and prepared. Underground utility work was nearly complete, and the first structural components waited nearby on massive flatbed trailers, shrouded in protective coverings. Hank stood in front of his bathroom mirror, fumbling with a tie he rarely wore. The ceremony wasn't scheduled until noon, but his nervousness had woken him at dawn. Today would bring not just Gabriel Chen, but a host of dignitaries. The governor had confirmed attendance, along with 2 state senators, the county commissioners, and even Catherine Delaney from the Economic Development Administration. Miller Farm would briefly become the center of attention for the entire state. A soft knock at his bedroom door interrupted his struggles with the tie. "Hank, it's Nancy. Pete sent me up to make sure you hadn't escaped out the window." Hank chuckled despite his nervousness. "Come in. Could use some help with this thing anyway." Nancy entered, immediately assessing the situation with a practiced eye. "Here, let me." She deftly adjusted the tie, smoothed his collar, and stepped back to examine the result. "There. Very distinguished." "Feel like a prize bull at the county fair," Hank grumbled, though there was no real complaint in his tone. "All this fuss for digging a hole in the ground." "It's more than that, and you know it," Nancy replied, her expression softening. "This is about the future of Clearwater County. People are excited for good reason." Downstairs, the house had been transformed. A catering team from Missoula had arrived at dawn, setting up elegant refreshment tables on the front lawn. Workers had erected a small stage near the construction site, complete with a podium and ceremonial shovels painted silver. Security personnel, both Chen's private team and state troopers assigned to the governor, conducted sweeps of the property. "Mr. Miller," Olivia greeted him as he descended the stairs. "Everything is on schedule. Mr. Chen's helicopter will land at 11:30. The governor arrives at 11:45. Ceremony begins at noon sharp." "Helicopter?" Hank repeated, adding this to the growing list of firsts he was experiencing. "Yes, sir. We've prepared a landing area in the south field, well away from the construction site and livestock." By 10 o'clock, guests had begun to arrive. Local farmers and ranchers, business owners from town, and what appeared to be every media outlet in Montana gathered in the designated viewing areas. Hank found himself shaking hands constantly, accepting congratulations and fielding questions about his vision for the project, as if he'd been the mastermind rather than a fortunate beneficiary. "Quite a turnout," Sheriff Connor observed, joining Hank near the refreshment table. Half expecting Westland to show up with protesters. "Don't jinx it," Hank muttered, scanning the crowd. Westland had been suspiciously quiet since his visit 2 weeks earlier, which made Hank more nervous than if he'd been actively causing problems. At precisely 11:30, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cut through the festive atmosphere. Heads turned skyward, as a sleek black helicopter with the Nexus Technologies logo approached from the west, circling once before descending gracefully to the temporary landing pad. Hank felt a strange tightness in his chest as he watched Gabriel Chen emerge from the aircraft, accompanied by a small entourage. Despite all the activity of the past weeks, despite the millions already invested in the project, a part of him had still half expected Chen to lose interest or change his mind. Seeing him arrive in person made the reality of it all finally sink in. Olivia appeared at Hank's side. "Mr. Chen would like a private word before the ceremony, if you're available." Moments later, Hank found himself in his own living room with one of the world's wealthiest men. Chen had dispensed with most of his entourage, bringing only Olivia and a security person who waited discreetly by the door. "Mr. Miller," Chen greeted him warmly, shaking his hand. "Thank you for accommodating all this commotion. I know public spectacles aren't your preference." "Seems to go with the territory," Hank replied. "Your people have been remarkably efficient." Chen smiled. "High praise from a farmer. No one understands the value of efficiency quite like those who work the land." He glanced toward the window, where the gathering crowd was visible on the lawn. "Before we join the festivities, there's something personal I wanted to share with you. Something that might help explain my particular interest in this project." From an inside pocket, Chen withdrew a small leather case, which he opened carefully to reveal an old photograph. He handed it to Hank. The photo showed a much younger Chen, perhaps 12 or 13, kneeling beside an elderly Asian man outside a modest rural dwelling. Between them sat a calico cat, remarkably similar to Callie, nursing several kittens. "My grandfather," Chen explained, a softness entering his voice, "a rice farmer in rural Sichuan province. My parents had already emigrated to America, but I spent summers with my grandparents until I was 15. Hank studied the photo, noting the obvious affection between the boy and the old man, and the protective way they both positioned themselves near the cat family. "That summer, there was a terrible fire in the village," Chen continued. "My grandfather's storage shed caught fire during a lightning storm. Inside was a cat. This cat, who had recently given birth. Everyone told him to stay back, that it was too dangerous, but he went in anyway." A ghost of a smile touched Chen's lips. "He was about your age then, and just as stubborn." Hank looked up from the photo, beginning to understand. "He saved the mother cat and all 5 kittens," Chen said. "Suffered burns on his hands and arms that never fully healed. When I asked him why he'd risked his life, he said something I've never forgotten. Sometimes the measure of a society isn't how it treats the powerful, but how it cares for the most vulnerable." Chen carefully returned the photo to its case. "My grandfather taught me that technology without compassion is hollow, that progress disconnected from tradition is rootless. When I saw the story about you running into that burning barn, it was like seeing his spirit alive in another part of the world." Hank felt unexpectedly moved by the personal revelation. "I'm honored by the comparison, though I'm not sure I deserve it. I just did what seemed right in the moment." "The best decisions often happen that way," Chen replied. "Now, I believe we have a ceremonial hole to dig." The groundbreaking ceremony proceeded with the polished efficiency that seemed to characterize everything associated with Gabriel Chen. The governor spoke about rural economic development, a state senator emphasized job creation, and Dr. Lin eloquently described the rehabilitation center's mission. When Chen himself took the podium, he spoke not just about technology and innovation, but about heritage and continuity, about honoring the past while building the future. Finally, it was Hank's turn to say a few words. Public speaking had never been his strong suit, and he approached the podium with trepidation. Looking out at the gathered crowd, neighbors he'd known his entire life alongside powerful figures from far beyond Clearwater County, he felt momentarily overwhelmed. Then he spotted Callie, who had somehow escaped from the house and now sat at the edge of the gathering, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws as she observed the proceedings with feline dignity. "My grandfather built the original barn on this property nearly 100 years ago," Hank began, finding his voice. "He couldn't have imagined what we're starting here today. But I think he would have approved of a project that respects the land while finding new ways to make it productive. That creates opportunity without erasing history." He paused, surprising himself with the emotion that welled up. "This farm has been Miller land for 3 generations. Thanks to this partnership, it will remain Miller land for generations to come, not frozen in the past, but evolving to meet new challenges while holding on to what matters most." The ceremonial shovels plunged into the prepared soil, flashbulbs popped, and applause rippled through the crowd. As officials posed for photographs, Hank stepped away from the platform, relieved that his part was done. He was making his way toward the house when Sheriff Connor intercepted him, his expression uncharacteristically grave. "Hank, we've got a situation developing. County Building Commissioner just received an emergency filing from Westland's attorneys. They're claiming the project violates a previously undisclosed historical preservation covenant on the property. Judge Harmon has issued a temporary stop work order effective immediately." Hank stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible. There's no such covenant on my land. Westland's people have produced documentation claiming your grandfather signed an agreement in 1945 designating the farm as having historical significance that limits development. They've convinced Harmon to halt all construction until a hearing can determine its validity." The celebration around them suddenly seemed hollow, the speeches and ceremonial shovels a meaningless pantomime. Just as Hank had feared, Westland had been quietly planning his counterattack, waiting for the moment of maximum impact to strike. "When's the hearing?" Hank asked, his mouth dry. "Monday morning. All work has to stop until then." Sheriff Connor glanced toward the stage, where Chen was still speaking with the governor, unaware of the legal bombshell that had just dropped. "Thought you should know before the commissioner serves the official notice. He's on his way now." Hank felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Just when he'd allowed himself to believe in this new future, Westland had found a way to threaten everything. Even if the covenant was eventually proven fraudulent, the delay could be costly, possibly enough to make Chen reconsider the entire project. As if sensing his distress, Callie appeared at his feet, looking up with those inscrutable feline eyes that somehow seemed to understand more than they should. Hank bent to stroke her fur, drawing unexpected comfort from her presence. "What now?" he murmured, as much to himself as to the cat. The weekend following the groundbreaking ceremony passed in a blur of legal consultations and frantic research. By Saturday afternoon, Chen had assembled a team of attorneys specializing in property law, historical preservation, and rural land use. They set up operations in Hank's dining room, transforming the simple farmhouse into a war room of laptops, legal documents, and coffee-fueled strategy sessions. Hank spent hours in his attic, digging through dusty boxes of family papers, searching for anything that might contradict Westland's claim about a historical covenant. His grandfather had kept meticulous records, but nothing suggested any such agreement had ever existed. "If this covenant is legitimate, why hasn't it come up before?" Hank asked during a Sunday strategy meeting. "I've made plenty of changes to the property over the years, added outbuildings, modified the house, installed irrigation systems." "That's exactly our argument," Chen's lead attorney explained. "A genuine historical covenant would have been triggered by previous modifications. The fact that no one, including county officials, was aware of its existence strongly suggests fabrication." "But can we prove that in court tomorrow?" Hank pressed, the anxiety evident in his voice. The attorneys exchanged glances. "We have circumstantial evidence and logical arguments, but without documentation explicitly disproving the covenant's existence, it's challenging. Judge Harmon tends to be cautious. He might extend the stop work order while a more thorough investigation is conducted." That night, Hank couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch swing in the darkness, Rusty dozing at his feet and Callie curled beside him. The construction site loomed as a shadowy outline across his property, the machines silent and still, an unsettling preview of what might become permanent if Westland's legal maneuver succeeded. "There's got to be something we're missing," Hank murmured, absently stroking Callie's fur. The mother cat had become his constant companion these past weeks, seeming to sense his moods and appearing whenever his spirits flagged. A sudden thought struck him. His grandfather's old desk, the massive oak piece that had been moved to the workshop years ago when Hank renovated the study. It had hidden compartments that had fascinated Hank as a child. Could there be documents tucked away there that hadn't been discovered during their search? Despite the late hour, Hank grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the temporary workshop. Rusty followed dutifully while Callie, to his surprise, trotted alongside them, unusually alert for a nighttime excursion. The old desk sat in the corner, its ornate craftsmanship out of place among the modern tools and equipment. Hank ran his hands along its familiar contours, remembering how his grandfather would sit here each evening, recording the day's work in leather-bound ledgers. One by one, Hank checked the compartments he remembered. Most were empty or contained only old pencil stubs and paper clips. But when he pressed the hidden lever that revealed the deepest drawer, something shifted inside. Reaching carefully into the narrow space, his fingers touched leather-bound paper. The journal he withdrew was small but thick, its pages yellow with age. Opening it carefully, Hank recognized his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. It was a personal diary, spanning the years 1944 to 1946, exactly when the supposed covenant would have been signed. Hank began reading, his heart racing. Entry after entry detailed his grandfather's interactions with the Westland family, not as allies but as adversaries. Marcus Westland's grandfather, it seemed, had attempted to acquire Miller Farm during the post-war years, using increasingly underhanded tactics when direct offers were refused. One entry, dated October 1945, sent a jolt through Hank. Westland approached today with document claiming historical designation that would prevent improvements. Says government interest in preserving original homesteads. Suspicious of timing. Consulted with Judge Browning, who confirmed no such program exists. Refused to sign. Westland threatened consequences. Let him try. Hands shaking with excitement, Hank continued reading. 2 weeks later, another entry. Westland filed false claim with county regarding property boundaries. Survey proved him wrong. Judge Browning advised documenting all interactions. Starting separate record of Westland's attempts to defraud, kept with land deeds in courthouse safe deposit. The courthouse safe deposit box, a practice many original homesteaders had followed to protect their most important documents. Hank had assumed his grandfather's box had been emptied decades ago, its contents merged with the family papers. What if it hadn't? Morning found Hank, Chen, and the legal team waiting outside the county courthouse an hour before it opened. The county clerk, a woman in her 60s who had known Hank's family for generations, was surprised by their urgency, but intrigued by their explanation. The old homesteader's boxes, she mused. Most families claimed those contents years ago, but there's a section in the basement archives that's never been fully processed. Let me see what I can find. 30 minutes later, she returned with a dusty metal box labeled Miller, 1923. Inside, preserved in a sealed envelope, lay a handwritten account of every interaction between John Miller and Frederick Westland, including documented attempts to forge the old farmer's signature on various legal instruments. Most damning was a draft of the very historical covenant currently being presented to the court, with notes from a county attorney of the time declaring it a fraudulent instrument designed to encumber the Miller property. When Judge Harmon's gavel called the emergency hearing to order at 10 a.m., Marcus Westland sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, his attorneys arrayed around him like an expensive suit of armor. His composure cracked visibly when Hank's legal team presented not only the journal, but the preserved evidence from the courthouse archive. "Your Honor," Chen's attorney argued, "what we have here is not merely evidence disproving the current claim, but documentation of a generational pattern of fraudulent attempts to acquire the Miller property through deception. The covenant presented by Mr. Westland is not just invalid. It appears to be a modern recreation of a scheme first attempted by his grandfather over 75 years ago." Judge Harmon, a deliberate man not known for emotional displays, removed his glasses slowly. "Mr. Westland, are you aware of the penalties for presenting fraudulent documents to this court?" The color drained from Westland's face as he whispered urgently to his attorneys. After a tense conference, his lead counsel rose. "Your Honor, in light of new evidence, we wish to withdraw our petition immediately. My client had no knowledge of any impropriety in the documents provided to him by his historical research team." "Convenient," the judge remarked dryly. "Stop work order is rescinded immediately. Mr. Westland, I strongly suggest you review any other historical claims before presenting them to my court. Mr. Miller, Mr. Chen, you're free to proceed with your project." He paused, fixing Westland with a steely gaze. "And the district attorney may wish to review this matter further." By early afternoon, construction equipment roared back to life on Miller Farm. Hank stood with Chen at the edge of the site, watching as workers enthusiastically returned to their tasks. "Your grandfather was a formidable man," Chen observed. "His foresight in documenting everything saved us considerable difficulty." "He always said proper records were as important as proper seeds," Hank replied, a new appreciation for his grandfather's wisdom settling over him. "Never thought I'd be grateful for his obsessive record-keeping quite like this." Chen smiled. "Sometimes the past protects the future in ways we don't expect." He turned to face Hank directly. "Speaking of the future, Doctor, Lynn has a proposal regarding Callie and her kittens. She believes they would make excellent therapy animals for the rehabilitation center once they're properly trained. They've already demonstrated remarkable social adaptability and comfort around humans." "You want to keep them here?" Hank asked, surprised by the tightness in his throat at the thought. He'd grown far more attached to the cat family than he'd expected. "With your permission, yes. They would live primarily at the center once it's completed, but with full visiting privileges to your house. A shared custody arrangement, you might say." Relief and something like joy washed over Hank. "I think that could work out just fine." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Hank stood before the completed barn, a breathtaking fusion of traditional architecture and cutting-edge technology. Solar panels that resembled traditional roofing materials captured energy. Salvaged beams from the original structure provided both support and character. Automated systems for feeding, climate control, and monitoring operated behind surfaces of weathered wood and hand-forged hardware. Adjacent to it, the rehabilitation center was nearing completion, its design complementing rather than competing with the agricultural aesthetic of the property. Already, Dr. Lin's team had begun setting up equipment and preparing habitats for the first patients. Callie supervised these developments with queenly dignity from her favorite perch on the porch railing. Her kittens, now nearly grown, had begun their training as therapy animals, each showing particular aptitudes for different roles. The little orange tabby had a special gift for comforting anxious birds of prey, while the black kitten demonstrated remarkable patience with injured fawns. Hank's daily routine had evolved, but not fundamentally changed. He still rose at dawn, still tended his fields, still took satisfaction in the tangible results of his labor, but now he worked alongside researchers developing more efficient irrigation techniques, collaborated with veterinary specialists on improving livestock welfare, and occasionally, though he'd never admit it, enjoyed leading tours for school groups visiting the rehabilitation center. On this particular morning, Hank paused to appreciate the view. Where once he had seen only the dwindling prospects of a struggling farm, He now saw a vibrant future unfolding, one that honored his family's legacy while embracing new possibilities. "Not bad for an old farmer and some stray cats," he murmured to Callie, who blinked at him slowly in what he'd come to recognize as feline affection. As if in response, his phone buzzed with a text message from Chen, who had become a regular visitor to the farm between his global business commitments. Final permits approved for Phase 2 expansion, wildlife observation area, and educational center funded. Your grandfather would be proud. As am I to call you partner and friend. Hank smiled, tucking the phone away and scratching Callie behind the ears. The cat, who had once been a homeless stray, now wore a special collar identifying her as the Chief Feline Therapy Coordinator of Second Chance Ranch at Miller Farm. Sometimes, Hank reflected, the most important turning points in life come disguised as disasters. A barn fire, a litter of kittens, a split-second decision to run toward danger rather than away from it, and sometimes the simple act of saving something vulnerable can end up saving everything else that matters.